Hi everyone, and welcome to the National Environmental Science Program's Climate Systems Hub webinar, Climate Effective Management, our Adaptation Catalogue for Conservation. So my name is Heidi Evans, and I'm the Climate Systems Hub Knowledge Broker for New South Wales, and I sit in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. So that's the New South Wales DQ, not the federal DQ. So today's webinar is a chance to showcase a fantastic tool that one of our project teams have been working hard on called AdaptLog. While I'll let them tell you more about it, AdaptLog is about building the capacity of conservation managers on the ground as they seek to implement adaptation intervention actions for species and ecosystems hit hard by the impacts of climate change. So this is a challenge being faced by conservation managers across the country, and today you'll also get to hear some of their stories. But before we properly get started, I just want to acknowledge the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. They're the traditional custodians of Canada Bay in Sydney, where I'm joining you from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and would like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today and to the traditional owners of the lands where you are. The Climate Systems Hub recognises the important role that traditional knowledge plays in understanding our climate. Okay, so if this is your first Climate Systems Hub webinar, a special welcome to you. These free webinars take place every month, and they're designed to provide an opportunity for learning and for interaction with a broad range of topics and experts. We've had a great range of presentations to date, and you can find those recordings on our website. So speaking of recordings, this webinar is being recorded. The link will be available from the Climate Systems Hub website after the webinar, and it's also going to be emailed out to everyone who registered. We'd also appreciate if you could fill in our feedback survey after the webinar. I'll mention it again at the end, and the link will be posted in the chat. So we're going to have some time for questions later in the webinar. I want to encourage you at any time during the session to pop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many questions as we can, but get in early. We might not get to all of them. All right, so with that housekeeping sorted, to get us started, I'm going to introduce the project team behind AdaptLog. So that is the team leading the Climate Systems Hub project called Climate Effective Management for Threatened Species and Protected Places. So Alistair Hobday, Alistair is the project lead. He is a research director from CSIRO Environment, with research focusing on the impacts of climate change and extreme events on biodiversity and fishery resources, as well as developing, prioritising and testing adaptation options for conservation. Sarah Bolter is the lead of our adaptation initiative, and she's based at the University of Tasmania, and she's spent the last decade building and supporting climate adaptation research and practice in Australia. Jess Melbourne Thomas is a principal research scientist and team leader at CSIRO Environment, and she has a background in ecosystem modelling, transdisciplinary science and knowledge brokering. Claire Mason is a postdoctoral researcher at CSIRO Environment with a background in seabird ecology, conservation science and climate adaptation interventions. And last but not least, Jason Hartog is a senior experimental scientist and team leader at CSIRO Environment with expertise in computer science, oceanographic modelling and seasonal forecasting. So yeah, I'm going to hand over now to Alistair to get us into it.
Thanks, Heidi. We know very well from projections from groups like the IPCC that we're going to see rapid temperature changes for the rest of the century, depending on the amount of emissions that we have. We tend to visualise that as in the schematic on the lower left-hand side, as if the climate was just going to have a strong trend into the future. But we know that there are also climate extremes and climate variability that are the wiggles that are depicted on this graph. And those are examples like floods or droughts or heat waves or cold spells. And all of those also have an impact on the natural environment as well as the long-term change. On the next slide, it's really clear from this study from 2020, which showed that between 30 and 80% of things that we tried to do to help species and communities in the natural communities were impacted by near-term weather. What if we knew then about what that near-term weather was going to do? Would we be able to have better conservation outcomes? And that was one of the main challenges that our project considered. As well as these short-term variability, on the next slide, I'll just show you again a slide that will be very familiar to you that shows you how much the trend is actually varies through the year, with on the x-axis the month of the year, and on the y-axis, for example, surface temperature. And you can see the two coloured lines on this plot are the temperatures over the last 2 years, and they've really been very dramatic increases compared to what had been observed historically, and even in through the 90s and 2000s. So it's really apparent that we're going to have to do conservation in a very different environment as a result of this climate change signal. It's really important that we not give up on reducing greenhouse gases, and mitigation then is a really important thing. And so no talk around adaptation is ever complete without acknowledging that we do have to reduce greenhouse gases. But the amount of change that we're going to see over the next 30 years is kind of locked in. And so we're going to see warming no matter what we do today. As a result of that, we're going to have to undertake adaptation efforts. And these are local in scale. Usually they're aimed at species, habitats, or people. And by having a good adaptation strategy, you can increase the flexibility that you have in managing vulnerable species and ecosystems. These natural environments are going to be really vulnerable. And for example, these plots from the IPCC reports are called burning embers plots. And each one of these vertical bars shows you the temperature at which you expect system change to occur. On the left-hand top plot then is some scenarios of change out to the year 2100. And you can see, even if you follow the 1.5 degree line, which is the lower blue one, and then project your eye across to these burning embers plots, every one of them has gone into colour before 1.5 degrees. And so unique and threatened species are likely to see the impacts at 0.5 degree. Extreme weather events will increase, and so on. And then particularly for freshwater and marine systems in the middle plot that I've outlined there, we're seeing biodiversity impacts with only 1 or 2 degrees of warming that are going to be very, very substantial. As you know, we've ticked over 1.5 degrees in a single year this year. And so we're right on this threshold of, I think, pretty challenging conditions for our natural systems in Australia and around the planet. The evidence that species and natural ecosystems aren't coping is quite widespread. An obvious one is extinction, and Australia's just started to record extinctions of terrestrial species as a result of climate. We're also seeing things like changes in distribution, abundance, and physiology and phenology, and those are being observed widely in marine and terrestrial systems today. And then we have contributions from modelling studies that project widespread loss through to the end of the century. There is still considerable uncertainty in these projected changes. There won't be clear winners and losers, and it's difficult to see, what the general patterns are yet. And so one suggestion has been we have to monitor more intensively, respond to the threats, and be very fast in those responses. It's with this context that our project was initiated under the Climate Systems Hub, and it had 3 goals to improve threatened species and protected places management. The first one is to identify options for active adaptation interventions. The second was to provide both short and long-term forecasts that would help conservation planning. And the third aim was to develop the frameworks and decision support tools that would help people make decisions based on the first 2 products. Today, we're launching AdaptLog, which addresses the first aim. That's going to help identify options for active adaptation to address the climate change threats, both near and long term. In fact, there's a lot we can do. If we think about adaptation as being the goal to reduce vulnerability, if we're exposed to a warming climate and our animal is sensitive to that warming climate, then there's a potential impact. We can offset, though, with the adaptive capacity considerations, which may decrease vulnerability. So interventions or adaptations that can reduce exposure include translocation, habitat modification, shading, or engineering the environment. Interventions or adaptations that reduce sensitivity include supplemental feeding animals, modifying their habitat, treating their disease so that they can cope better with the exposure that they receive. And finally, in adaptive capacity, we can increase adaptive capacity by reducing things like the pest load, reducing their predators, or in the case of fisheries, reducing the bycatch of that particular animal. So just with that simple example, there are lots and lots of levers to pull. The next slide just illustrates some of these levers. In the top left-hand side, aggregating vulnerable life stages together to help them get through a vulnerable period of time. In the top right-hand side, translocating albatross to new locations with the use of artificial nests and decoys. In lower left, offshore islands that have been created to create new habitat for nesting shorebirds. And the list goes on, as we'll show you with AdaptLog shortly. These are examples of species interventions, and they're also examples of protected places or vulnerable ecosystem activities. And so, for example, we can manage water distribution through a landscape. We can install sprinklers in the wilderness to cope with fire outbreaks when they occur, as in the lower right-hand side. We can install artificial structures to improve seawall habitats and recruitment surfaces for estuarine species. So lots and lots of things we can do, but we don't know where to find them. In Australia, there's a fair bit going on, and in the work of the project over the last 3 years, we've collected some of what we know is going on and publicised it with in our climate adaptation calendars. The map shows that by colour, each of the kind of adaptation success story that we've featured in the calendars. And there are great stories that I hope that you will see in previous calendars, or if you're lucky enough to receive one of the 2025 calendars. Part of this communication over the past few years has made it clear that people receive information in different ways. And the challenge for our project team has been supplying that information in a way that decision makers can use it best. Into the chat, you'll now find a link, if you choose to look at it later, where we would ask you for some feedback about how you want to learn about adaptation interventions in conservation. We think we've sorted through some of it, and we're going to tell you about how one of the ways that you can learn about adaptation intervention when Claire takes over.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm going to give you a demo of AdaptLog today. Before I begin, I'd just like to talk about evidence. So we've been collecting these interventions since 2018. And as Alistair has shown, there's a real need for these novel and innovative strategies that haven't been tried before. However, in searching the literature and searching more informal or grey sources, there is a variety of evidence that exists for these types of interventions. So some have been published in the peer-reviewed literature and have really formal evidence where there's been experimental design and robust analysis. We also know that a lot of NGOs, governments, councils, and a lot of other players in conservation in Australia are testing many of these things on the ground. However, it's often hard to access publicly the details of these trials. We know as well that there's a lot of experienced field expertise in Australia of deploying conservation interventions, and that also exists as a form of evidence. And also, of course, having in-depth ecological understanding or prior knowledge and having a good idea of whether something might be a good approach to try or not. So we hope that AdaptLog is the beginning of building an evidence base for these types of interventions. But yeah, as you can see, a lot of different types of evidence exist. So when you're in the process of finding and considering adaptation options, either for a protected place or a species, we've been talking to people over the past couple of years who are looking for options for adaptation. And these are the kinds of uses that we think that AdaptLog might have for people looking for adaptation options. So the most obvious, of course, is brainstorming. So using AdaptLog to bring in new, novel, innovative approaches from other contexts and species that might be able to be applied in your circumstance. You might also be looking for ways to pull that sensitivity or adaptive capacity lever that Alistair talked about and applying more traditional conservation activities with a climate lens. And these also include, some of these are included in AdaptLog. Also referring back to that bumpy road on the way to our long-term future, you may be looking to find approaches to deploy after a more near-term climate hazard or an extreme weather event. Or you might, I'm going to talk a little bit about our decision support that we've provided alongside AdaptLog, and you might use this and kind of a bit of the resources that we have provided around thinking around intervening for climate change and comparing between different types of levers you might pull or different types of intervention categories, and working through that process to provide a business case to show how you have been through a decision-making process. So this is the process of finding and considering adaptation options, but of course this step occurs within a much broader context of making decisions around conservation. So this forms the homepage of AdaptLog to place this tool in the context of the broader decision-making adaptation process. So of course, before you start looking for options, you're going to be using some overarching decision-making principles that recognise the role of rights holders, knowledge holders, and engages in true engagement of people affected by decisions made, and making sure that you're creating opportunities for benefits and collaborations. You may also consider a more ecological or mechanistic approach to what kind of ecological functions and processes you're looking to tap into as part of your adaptation process. When you're ready to brainstorm and explore different adaptation options, you can enter the Adaptation Catalogue of Conservation, and you'll be looking potentially in the first stages at step 1 and 2. So browsing around, finding new ideas, and sorting through the options. I'm also going to give you just a quick look at these consideration wheels and points to ponder, which we've also provided as part of version 3 of AdaptLog, which we're launching today. And they'll be available for you to go and explore. So I'm just going to stop sharing and go to AdaptLog now. So bear with me. So here we are at the homepage of AdaptLog. This is the diagram I was telling you about before, where you can start your search at either searching the catalogue or looking at some of the decision support. For reference, this is the homepage, and you can navigate across to the About page, and this is where you can find a lot of information about the user guide, so some more background on the tool, a glossary for all the different intervention categories. We've classified the interventions into a threat glossary for all the different threats. We have classified the interventions in mitigating, and this is where you can find the decision support for the consideration wheels and the points to ponder, which are later steps of the process. So I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of searches for you, but we encourage you to go and explore this tool in your own time as well. So clicking up the top of the diagram will take you to the search. So we've created 4 different search options or entry points for searching AdaptLog: ecological community that's being targeted, the species being targeted, the intervention category, and the threat category. The glossaries for intervention category and threat category can be found on the About page. I'm going to demonstrate a search for species now. So you've got 3 different options here for searching for species. I'm going to demonstrate a search for the shy albatross, a bird I am familiar with. So you can scroll down the list. Now, I think in Teams, you can't see the drop downs for some reason when sharing screen, but I'll just go straight to the results if you can't see those. So if you run a search for shy albatross, you'll see there are 2 entries in the search results here. If you're looking for a broader range of options than what is returned by a single species search, we encourage you to search for family. And you can, if you search by taxa, it will pre-fill the family and species selector. So I know the family of shy albatross, search by family. And now you can see there's a much larger range of interventions that have been implemented for the bird family Diomediae. In our search results, we have the intervention maturity, which is sorted in the search results by all the on-ground activities being shown first, and any planning or policy documents or recommendations are shown at the end. If there's the target, the intervention category, a short summary, and if you want to look at more information around any of these interventions, you can click on the info, the little eye on the right-hand side, and this will take you to the full record page of an intervention. So there's a map with some location information in the caption. You can download this page as a PDF by clicking this button, and some more information about the context of the intervention. So we've provided the taxa, the specificity, threats, a vulnerability framing if available, and some further details here. We've linked, this kind of is a starting point for people to take the further reading and the information here and do further research. And down this bottom section here is we have released with version 3 of AdaptLog, and this is the implementation guidance. So we've linked conservation evidence here as a wonderful resource of evidence of effectiveness of different types of conservation activities, which is a great place to start if you're looking for that. And down here we have a consideration wheel. So this is the beginning of some of the decision support we're providing with AdaptLog. We have summarised some different considerations at the scale of intervention categories. So here for disease management, this intervention was a disease treatment for shy albatross chicks. And you can see that there's 6 considerations here in this wheel with an indication of relative importance of these different considerations for all 18 of the intervention categories in AdaptLog. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and interest around this, and what you can do, please reach out to the project team, or you can click here, which will take you to a detailed PDF document, which outlines this process and this tool. Going back to the search, we'll just show you a couple of other searches. So, for example, intervention category. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see the drop down, but the drop down lists all 18 intervention categories with the number of interventions in the catalogue in brackets. So, for example, there's 18 examples of conservation introductions outside of the historic range, and this search returns them here, and a similar kind of thing. So you can search through the results and click the eye for more information on any of these interventions. So I'll stop sharing there, but this URL at the top is publicly available, and this we encourage you to go and have a look at this resource and reach out to the project team with any questions, or put them in the Q&A function of the chat. Just gonna, oops. Just should get back to the slides. Okay. Great. So as you explore AdaptLog, if there's anything that is missing, either a project you're aware of or a project you've been involved in, I invite you to submit these via this form and we can add them into the next version of AdaptLog. We're very grateful for our steering committee members listed on the screen. We've run a variety of case study workshops across Australia with some leading practitioners in this space listed here. And we've been beta testing this tool over the last 12 months and really appreciate all the feedback we've received through there. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speakers today. We have two guest speakers that we've been working with through this project who are doing some amazing work in this space that we would like to showcase as part of our webinar. First off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nick McGregor, who is the Science Manager at Parks Australia, which is the Commonwealth Department. And Nick is responsible for managing iconic protected places around Australia, including Kakadu, Uluru and Katajuda, Norfolk Island, Christmas Island, just to name a few. Nick has been involved in protected place policy management and ecology, both in the UK and Australia for many years. And Nick has been an integral part of our project as a member of our project steering committee over the past 2.5 years. I'd like to invite Nick to join when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Claire, and hello everyone. Today I'd like to give some brief thoughts about this topic of planning adaptation in protected areas, giving just a couple of examples from the places that my agency, Parks Australia, manages. Go to the next slide, please, Claire. Thank you. We look after a very large and diverse protected area estate, both on land and at sea, including a range of terrestrial parks that Claire mentioned, the Australian Marine Park Network, and also now we oversee the Indigenous Protected Area Network. So we have a very diverse set of areas, and of course climate change is an important consideration across that whole estate for the reasons that Alistair outlined earlier. Could you click on slide one, please? Thank you very much, Claire. Oh, sorry, just go back one slide for a minute.
Sorry.
An arrow being added there. So the two case studies that I'd like to talk through today are Kakadu National Park and Norfolk Island National Park. Two quite contrasting areas, one of our biggest parks and one of our smallest. These are not complete case studies by any means. For a start, I'm focusing just on terrestrial issues and not on marine, and certainly not giving a complete picture of climate impacts and adaptation, but really just using them to provide a bit of background to illustrate some more general thoughts. But starting with Kakadu, it's a very large park, Australia's second largest national park, sitting on the coast of the Northern Territory between Darwin and Arnhem Land. It has a hot tropical climate, as you can see from the graph on the left, a very marked seasonal rainfall pattern with a very wet season and a very dry season. Next slide, please. This enormous area contains a very wide range of landscape types, from stony escarpment and plateau, lowland forest and woodlands, pockets of upland and lowland monsoon forest, and a very extensive range of aquatic systems, including estuaries, coastal marsh, some very large rivers and their floodplains, and extensive wetlands. Next slide, please. And that diversity of landscape supports an equally diverse range of values. Kakadu has a really incredible amount of biodiversity, including many threatened species and a threatened ecological community. But equally importantly, it's a very important park for cultural reasons. It supports ongoing living culture, Bini Mongolic traditional owners, an amazing collection of rock art, historic sites that provide a record of human habitation going back tens of thousands of years. And it's also an important tourist destination, locally, nationally and internationally. Next slide, please. Kakadu under a changing climate it's going to be a challenging place. It's likely to experience even more extreme temperatures than it does today, and that seasonal pattern that I outlined earlier could well become more extreme. We could experience more extreme and more frequent flood events during the wet season. We are likely to face a less predictable or shorter and therefore harder to manage dry season with increased fire risk. Increased severity of cyclones and storms could damage both natural and cultural values and infrastructure, and the park's freshwater wetlands are vulnerable to coastal erosion and saline intrusion from rising seas. Next slide, please. As everywhere, climate change is not happening in a vacuum. These pressures are coming on top of a range of existing pressures in the park, particularly from a diverse range of invasive plants and animals. And some of these existing pressures are likely to interact with the pressures of climate change. For example, feral buffalo could exacerbate the impacts of saline intrusion into wetlands, and high biomass grassy weeds such as gamba grass could increase fire risk. Next slide, please. Norfolk Island is completely different. So, in contrast to Kakadu's 20,000 square kilometres, Norfolk Island National Park is about 6.5 square kilometres in 2 locations on 2 very small islands out in the South Pacific. The climate there is much milder than it is in Kakadu, and the rainfall is lower and more even across the year, as you can see from the top left of the screen. Next slide, please. Norfolk Island National Park supports a range of different subtropical forest and other vegetation types. These communities are unique in their species composition. The flora of the islands has a lot of links with the flora of New Caledonia and New Zealand, as well as Australia. Next slide, please. And those unique ecosystems and the island's geographic position at the border of the tropics and subtropics, and border of the tropics and the temperate zone, and in relation to the other islands in the South Pacific, supports a unique biodiversity, including a very large number of threatened species, certainly the largest density of threatened species that we have in our estates, I believe. There are more than 50 threatened species packed into that very small area. Next slide, please. Like Kakadu, Norfolk's likely to experience increased severe storms in the future, but one of the big issues, at least on land, is rainfall. We know that both extreme wet and extreme dry conditions have negative impacts for many of the species out there. This picture doesn't show it quite as clearly as I would like. I couldn't find a perfect picture to illustrate this, but the park, it has a very hilly terrain with water falling through rain and collecting through mist in the trees, and then it runs down the hills and out into the sea. There's no standing water currently in the park, so it's dependent on ephemeral streams, which you might just be able to make out in this picture. So one of the great concerns is if this environment dries out and these streams are recharged less frequently, whether we will see tipping points in some of the forest communities. Next slide, please. And again, climate change here is adding to a range of existing pressures, including feral predators, the impacts and legacy of past clearing and erosion, and a wide range of we think may be affecting water availability in some places, and they include a eucalyptus plantation on the one edge of the park, which increases fire risk in a place that historically has never had fire before. Next slide, please. So these two parks are obviously very different. If I had included some small case studies on some of our other parks, such as coral atolls in the Indian Pacific Oceans, or the semi-arid environments of Ulu-Kata-Chuta, or the coastal environments we have in Budiri National Park in Jervis Bay, they would have been very different again. But one thing that all of these places have in common is the adaptation challenge that Claire and Alistair have outlined. This figure, which is another product from this NEST project, tries to outline that challenge. But the triangle represents a range of different adaptation actions, starting on the left with the sorts of things that conservation has always done. That's broad, overarching threat abatement, dealing with non-climate threats. And then as we move from the left to the right through the triangle, we move first into management for threats that interact with climate change, and then finally into actions that are specifically to reduce exposure to climate change itself. And I think everywhere, protected areas face a challenge to move beyond the left-hand side of the diagram and to consider whether there's more that should be done on the right-hand side. I think it's important to note that this isn't necessarily a transition. It doesn't mean stopping existing management. In many cases, that will be a really important foundation for future management. But considering whether there are new things or modified things that we need to do to specifically address a change in climate. Next slide, please. So these next couple of slides are really just some thoughts about applying that conceptual model to these two parks that I've outlined today. I should stress that this is not a formal adaptation plan. It's really just some ideas at this stage. So I've starting here with Kakadu. I've just noted at various points in the triangle some of the things that I think we may need to consider. So on the left, we have existing foundational park management, such as managing fire, managing herbivores, managing predators, managing weeds in general, and of course, maintaining park infrastructure. But then we can start to think about refining and targeting some of those things. For example, in managing rock art, thinking about some of the impacts on rock art, managing weeds, thinking about some of those fire-promoting weeds that could interact with the worsening fire season, and starting to modify our infrastructure to take climate change into consideration. And then further still to the right, we can think about increasing our use of interventions such as wet season burning, which is a method of burning, drawing on traditional Indigenous practices that seeks to reduce sorghum grass during the wet season and so reduce fuel loads during the traditional dry season fire window. We're interested in identifying potential refuges from various climate and non-climate pressures and potentially using those as focal areas in which to target management. And then at the apex of the triangle, indicated by the question mark, there are new things that started thinking about, in some cases probably haven't even considered yet. Next slide, please. And it's a similar picture on Norfolk Island. On the left, we have basic park management, again, managing many of those invasive species and continuing some existing management for some of our individual threatened species. But then as we start to think about climate change, we're certainly going to need to think more about fire. As I said, fire is not part of the Norfolk Island system. The fire risk will increase, especially having some flammable introduced species. We will need to think about potentially replacing some of those flammable introduced species with native forest. We may need to think more about ex situ conservation of vulnerable species, targeting our management to particular locations with a climate lens, considering whether our restoration objectives, especially on Phillip Island, which is that very barren landscape that I showed in one of my earlier slides, whether they're still valid under a changing climate or whether we need to think about a different endpoint. Again, as in Kakadu, trying to identify refuge areas and target restoration effort in those places. And then out on the far right, again, a very hypothetical question about whether in a potentially drying environment, we need to think about more radical solutions to retain water in the landscape. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about this, when we're thinking about trying to move from the left to the right in those diagrams, there's huge potential, I think, for us to learn from other areas, and from other areas, I hope, to learn from us. Really, I think every conservation project in area across Australia and across the world can learn from other areas. Important to note that, in my opinion, there's no adaptation blueprint. There's no specific recipe that can be transferred from one area to another. Every place is different. The context varies, values vary, pressures vary, the starting point will vary, and the aspirations and philosophy of managers and residents and other stakeholders will vary. But we can take a lot of ideas and inspiration from other places. And in many cases, I think the innovation in adaptation comes from taking ideas that have been used elsewhere and modifying them and applying them to a local context. So thinking about how and when to apply them, how they integrate with other management. I think a lot of activities in adaptation are not necessarily new, but they might be very new to the area. For example, Alistair talked about sprinklers in World Heritage areas before. That was probably a very radical and innovative idea at the time, but sprinklers themselves, of course, are nothing new. Sprinklers have been used elsewhere. So I think it's partly about widening our scope of consideration of different actions in order to think about what local innovations we might want to apply. But of course, that depends on that information being accessible. Next slide, please. Which is, of course, where this initiative comes in. I think it's a fantastic attempt to very successfully bring together in a systematic way a lot of really important and valuable evidence, and as Claire has outlined, to present it in a useful, searchable way. I think it's great, the variety of examples, both in Australia and overseas, that have started to be collected. I really like the way it's linked to conservation evidence, which is, of course, another important initiative to try to share information among conservation practitioners and make available information that is not necessarily very findable in either the scientific or the general grey literature. And I hope very much that this is the start of something that will become a very long-lasting and extremely valuable resource for conservation practitioners and decision makers into the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much for your presentation. Next, we have Eloise Haskin, who is a marine biologist and experienced diver, as well as being the Marine Program Manager at WWF Australia, and she's based in Western Australia. Eloise leads some fascinating and innovative work in climate adaptation as part of her role, which she will tell us about today. And some of her work was featured in our very first 2023 climate adaptation calendar for this project. Thank you, Eloise. I'll pass to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me on today. So I'm so excited to be sharing a project that can be fed exactly into a platform such as this one. This is a climate adaptation project focused on quite species-specific stuff, so focusing on marine turtles and the feminisation trends we're starting to see more and more around the world. So just in case anyone isn't aware of what feminisation is, essentially turtles have got temperature-dependent sex determination, so warmer sands are actually increasing the number of females that are born. And of course, we do need to have an adequate number of males in the mix for populations to be sustained into the future. So I'm just going to pretty much be running through our project, very high level, but happy to answer questions at the end if needed. And next slide, please. So we explored a whole focusing on, of course, data gaps. These were focused on how can turtle nests be cooled, when can turtle nests be cooled, what are operational sex ratios, so pretty much the number of male versus females at their adult breeding ages to enable successful breeding seasons, where to focus efforts and help prioritising where these sorts of things may be done, and how to scale. So I'm essentially going to be taking us through the toolkit that's been developed over the last few years. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I won't be jumping into all of the graphs just in the interest of time, but feel free to view and let me know if there are questions at the end. But we asked some central questions about how to cool turtle nests, and asked a big question about seawater, which has historically been a little bit of a question mark if that's a safe thing to do, out of the interest of if the salinity of the seawater might actually cause harm to turtle eggs. And this is in the context of using water or seawater as an irrigation technique, cooling down the top sands and the nests below. Essentially, the takeaway message is that we found that seawater is a nice, viable alternative and certainly safe to use as well, so long as it's been done at the right time of the breeding season. This work was quite novel, and we have a couple of manuscripts that have come out about this work. Just to the next slide, please. We also wanted to understand if one of the other elements of climate change outside of warming, heavier rainfalls and more frequent rainfalls, might have, cooling effects on sands. As we expected, they absolutely do. But if they're coupled with other mitigation measures, such as shading, man-made shade, or more, somewhat natural shades, those that the effects of the cooling is actually even more, and it lasts longer as well. So it can actually keep nests cool enough to come back into those sort of male-producing temperature zones. So we'll go into the next one. This kind of also led to the question of, well, when exactly should you do this kind of mitigation work, if you're an on-ground manager needing to do this? So we wanted to know more specifically when during the, egg-laying period is the sex determined in a nest. We knew that generally speaking, for sea turtles, it's within the middle third of the incubation period, but still this is close to 20 days, so pretty broad. We, ex situ, the team explored for green turtles and for loggerhead turtles by trialling 3 and 7 day temperature drops. We wanted to understand if they would be enough to actually increase male production and also work out exactly when that period is. The outcomes was that both 3 and 7 days temperature drops can improve male production, in nesting sites where male production is not enough. 7 days was much more successful. However, even the 3 day was producing more males compared to the control. So that was really great. And for green turtles, the kind of more specific point was the middle of the middle third, whereas for loggerheads, it was actually either side. And again, so those 7 day drops was enough. So another takeaway is that a single brief one-off cooling event on a nest will actually cool it enough to improve male production, which was great. Next slide. We also wanted to understand, go into or, give managers on ground the opportunity to go into management more informed. So we have been trying to add to the pool of knowledge of what operational sex ratios are in more locations around the world, essentially that being how many males and females are there of breeding age who are actually coming back to breed. We did this in the southern Great Barrier Reef. The team conducted this work using drone surveys, essentially counted up all the turtles during that season and found that even though there has been female bias in that area of the southern Great Barrier Reef for some time, that the operational sex ratio remained balanced. So kind of reiterating and confirming that there's a little bit of a buffer between when you start to see the effects on, the eggs versus when that might be coming into play in the adult population. Also, we figure this is probably likely the scenario because the males come and breed more frequently than the females, most likely. So we also, the team was exploring hindcasting and forecasting modelling of sand temperatures across important areas of the Asia Pacific to just add to that body of knowledge of where is feminisation actually an issue, because we can't blanket this as a problem for all turtles. We do actually get climate resilient stocks as well. And, on-ground managers don't need to be wasting time and resources on populations who may not need intervention. So a very important part of the puzzle too. So I'll just draw attention to one, which was in Papua New Guinea, very equatorial. scale, but was seemingly a very climate resilient population for now. And just interesting to note that because it's not all that far away from Rayne Island, an area in the northern part of Australia, which has a lot of the northern Great Barrier Reef turtles actually coming there to breed that stock. And that area is feminizing at a rate of about 99% of the hatchlings. So extremely severe. And yeah, interesting to have that contrast. And it certainly draws attention to the fact that every beach is going to be unique and have a different scenario. And we, managers need to go into that, understanding the situation. Next slide. So we kind of, overall, there's been this sort of development of a bit of a toolkit of how to do your assessments, how to actually do the cooling and so on. And we the next phase of what we're doing with this is trying to scale it and also trying to make it as accessible and inclusive as possible, because we recognize that not every on-ground manager across Australia, the Asia Pacific and so on are going to be academics. And a lot of this is published in, academic journals. And not always is there going to be English spoken as first languages and so on. So we wanted to make, as well as a centralized framework manuscript, which will be peer reviewed and published, a more sort of accessible version. Both of these are still in development right now. We do have just some small snippets of the very draft version of the more accessible version. And in addition to that, we're connecting with First Nations ranger groups around Australia, listening to their species and cultural priorities. Often turtles are one of these, and working with them to try to understand how this work might be practical and beneficial to on-country management of these culturally important species, because of course this is potentially how we can reach much more remote areas while also making sure that those sorts of localized priorities are seen and heard and acted upon around the rest of Australia. So this work has just started within the Northern Territory, supporting several amazing partners. So I think that's probably me and this project in a summarised form. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll pass back to Claire.
Thank you so much, Elle. What a wonderful program. I'm going to quickly pass to Jess now to see if we can squeeze in some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks everybody. And thanks to the audience for some really fantastic questions that are coming through. We'll get to as many of them as we can in the time that we have remaining, but I think please feel free to reach out to anyone in the project team if you have questions you'd like to ask after the webinar, and we'll also endeavour to make answers available after the webinar to questions that we didn't get to. So the first one that we have here is a question about another NESP Climate Systems Hub project called Adapt Land and Sea. And the question is about how AdaptLog interacts with that project. So perhaps, Claire, you might be able to start on that one.
Yeah, so Adapt Land and Sea is a project also in the NESP Climate Systems Hub being led by Jenny Steiger at the University of Tasmania, and HIT's making an online web platform to provide guidance for land and sea managers around Australia, and HIT will include products such as AdaptLog from our project and other forms of guidance for land and sea managers. And it should be coming next year, I think, with the early stages.
Thanks, Claire. Alistair or Sarah, would you like to add anything on Adapt Land and Sea?
No, probably just to confirm middle of next year.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So the next question is referring back to the point you made earlier, Claire, about business cases and how this person is saying within their organisation there's a desire to know that someone has tried an adaptation before, and it really helps to reduce the perceived risk of failure or being too soon to do something that may not work. So I wonder if as a team we might elaborate a little bit on the thinking that we've done around how AdaptLog can support people in making business cases around particular adaptation actions. Claire, again, maybe you'd like to talk about some of the thinking you've done there.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the consideration wheels and points to ponder as kind of later detailed steps in that homepage diagram are something that we've developed as part of this project to help support people making decisions around intervening for climate change. And as part of that, we will the PDFs are on the page now. We'll still be developing them over the next few weeks, including providing some templates that people can download and fill in those wheels from their point of view and their context of how, different things have different social feasibility or different costs depending on the local context. And that template could be a useful resource to work through some of the decision-making process, and then have a record of that.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more, which I think should be a fairly quick one to answer. Oh, Alistair, did you want to add something on that previous question?
Yeah, we do specify in AdaptLog whether it has only been an idea that somebody's thought of and it's in a planning document versus it's an idea that's already been tested once, whether it's been in wide use. And I think that should provide more confidence in choosing one option over another one if you've got a skeptical decision maker around you.
Thanks, Alistair. So the final question I think we have time to squeeze in is about the maps that accompany the more detailed information about the interventions in the catalogue, and basically just asking if that's showing where the intervention has occurred.
Yes, that's right. There's different resolutions for the location. Some of them are more broad, just state-based approaches, and some are quite fine scale. And yeah, that's just a general indication of the location of the intervention.
Great, thank you. I think according to my run sheet, we're pretty much out of time for questions, but as I say, we will certainly endeavour to provide answers to those that were posed that we didn't get time for. Is that back to
Jess,
you now, Heidi?
If there's another quick one that you want to chuck in there, my wrap up will be enough.
Okay,
so
wonderful.
go. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's great to see there's so much interest. This is an interesting one. The person is saying AdaptLog looks like a great resource. And are we planning any other catalogues, such as for agricultural adaptation, which is something that has come up as a question before. So happy to respond to that one. Perhaps, Alistair, would you like to take that one? No. Well,
maybe Jess, I can just
thanks.
I mean, like, absolutely, everyone's always looking for case studies and examples of adaptation, because we learn by doing, and we learn by what others are doing, and there are some examples out there. One of our other NEST projects that's probably worth mentioning is developing a stock take of adaptation action or adaptation in Australia. It's a different format to AdaptLog, where it's not specifically looking at interventions, but it is going to be another great resource looking at what people are doing in terms of adaptation, and that's sector non-specific, and we hope to have that launched fairly early next year. So yeah, we'll keep people informed on when that one becomes available.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And just to flag that one of the other outputs from this project that we didn't have time to talk about today, and that Jason has been leading the development of a situational reports on near-term climate information, and we had imagined that a tool like that could also have applications, for instance, in adaptation planning for agriculture. So watch this space for more detail around the situational reports. Great, thank you again, and I'll hand back to Heidi for a wrap up.
Awesome, thanks, Jess. Thanks so much to our AdaptLog project team and your guests for sharing their work with us today. And thanks to you, audience, for participating in the session. As Jess said, we'll try and kind of do some kind of follow-up where we can answer some of those extra questions. Thanks for supporting the Climate Systems Hub. We hope you've learnt something new or been connected with a resource that can help you in your adaptation practice. Keep up to date on Climate Systems Hub news and upcoming webinars. Join our mailing list. The link is going to be in the chat. Quickly, as a little Christmas giveaway, anyone who pops an intervention action into the catalogue by COB Thursday this week, 29th of November, if you opt to include your contact details, we're going to post you a calendar, the beautiful and brand new 2025 Climate Adaptations for Australia's Biodiversity Calendar. Lastly from me, we value your feedback. There's a link to a form here to complete, but we'll also pop that link when we send around the webinar recording in an email. We'd love to know what you thought and let us design great webinars for the future. Thanks again to all of our presenters and especially to those behind the scenes who've been active and to get this together today. We will see you all next time.